I'm happy to announce India team number 2 has a perfect 12-0 score after 3 rounds. This is one of the teams that I picked going into the tournament as one of my favorites and a team that I was excited to follow. They got 4 really young players with a 5th strong player in Adiban. And what I'm going to do today is show you Nihal Sarin's game against Sebastian Bogner. This is a India 2 versus Switzerland matchup. And we have Nihal with the white pieces. So we see a Catalan structure form after d5, g3. This is called the Catalan when you see c4, d4, knight f3, g3 against this d5, e6, knight f6 setup. Catalan is one of my favorite openings from the white side, and I actually recently made a course on the Catalan. There's a link in the description to the Chess Goals courses. Currently 25% off during the Olympiad with the coupon code. So after bishop e7, bishop to g2, castle, there's tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of games at this point, depending on how wide of a reading range you set. Now there's a very rare move, queen to d3, and this has been played recently in a few different Catalans. I think Boris Gelfand has played it a few times, but most recently this was played by Alireza Firouzja in the most recent candidates tournament against Fabiano Caruana. So I'm very excited to see what happens with this queen to d3 idea, and I might try to implement it in some of my own games as well. Knight b to d7 played, castle. Now you might be wondering, why put the queen on d3? What's the purpose of this move? It's super flexible. So oftentimes in the Catalan, white wants to play pawn to e4 and create this triple pawn center, c4, d4, e4. The queen from d3 defends both of these light pawns in the triple center. Also, it keeps flexibility. White doesn't always know, does that bishop belong on f4, or should white play b3, bishop to b2? And white also might not know where to put this knight on b1, knight to c3, knight b to d2. And from d2, it would actually block the queen on d1 from guarding any center pawns. So usually you'll see queen to c2, if anything. What white can do here, and this is what I think Nihal was thinking, see what Bogner does from the black side, and then react to that setup. And let's just watch how Nihal Sarin plays with the imbalances in this game. So pawn to b6, and we've picked up a few games now via transposition, so there's about 20 games in the database here. White has scored an impressive 60.7%, and most of these players are GM level. C takes d5, E takes d5. Now this is something that I talk about in the Catalan course. When you see this pawn structure for black, the queenside fianchetto attempt with the pawn on d5, it's almost always a good idea once you see b6 and no pawn on c6 to grab this d5 pawn. C takes d5. It forces black to either take back with the knight, which would give white a huge center. You could play like e4 soon, rook to d1, or black has to take back with the pawn, which is what Bogner did in the game. The issue with this, though, is now you have this fianchetto bishop running into a pawn on d5, and white's bishop is perfectly placed to attack the pawn on d5. And then black has to figure out, what do I do with this pawn on c7? You don't want to leave it back because it's a target down the c file. But you also don't really want to put it on c6 because now that's a target square. And if you put it on c5, you still have this weak point on d5, right? So it kind of already puts a tough question on black. And if you look at the engine here, the eval is around 0.5. So I think this queen to d3 decision by Nihal was a really good practical choice because Sebastian already committed to b6, and the move order creates this structure where Nihal has some chances to play for the win. Knight to c3, bishop to b7, bishop to f4. So Nihal's putting all the pieces on good squares. And what he would like to do next is play rook c1, rook to d1, and then figure out, can I pressure that pawn on c7 more? Now we see an interesting decision by Bogner. He doesn't want to just sit back and allow Nihal to build up this position. So instead, he goes for knight to h5, threatening knight takes f4 and securing the bishop pair. So he would have two bishops against a bishop and knight. And at this point, it's a big decision for white. Do you allow this trade, knight takes f4, giving black the bishop pair? And if you allow it, how do you allow it? You play a move like e3. This is Stockfish's favorite move. You play a rook to the center. That's what Nihal ended up doing. Or do you retreat the bishop? Do you play something like bishop d2, bishop to e3? Stockfish also likes those decisions. Even bishop to e5 could be a good move. If knight takes, you probably take back with the pawn. And then this knight is sort of trapped out here on h5. Let's look at the Stockfish top line. Pawn to e3. Knight takes f4, e takes f4, and this is a slightly stronger version of the game. And let me show you white's plan here. It looks weird. You have the isolated d pawn, and black has the bishop pair, but there's a big attack brewing. White wants to play pawn to h4, knight to e5, king to h2, pawn to h5, knight back to g4, maybe pawn to h6, bishop to h3, right? White's moving all of these pieces over here at the king side, going after the black king pretty aggressively. And it's hard for black to figure out how do I respond to all of these threats. So in the game, we had rook a to d1 played, allowing black again to take this bishop on f4, but now we get a slightly different pawn structure. Instead of a pawn on g3, that pawn is now on e2. What's the difference? This pawn on d4 is no longer isolated because it has this e pawn to help defend it. And now we have a half-open g file for white. Okay, so at first glance, you would think black has the bishop pair, white has double pawns. This should be good for black, right? Stockfish agrees with you. It's a minus zero point 0.2, so black does have a small advantage here. Nihal has this half-open g file, though, which he can play with, and he has a super strong outpost square and this d5 pawn to target, in addition to maybe putting pressure down the c file against this c7 pawn. So let's see how this unfolds. We got a lot of imbalances to play with here. Rook to e8, knight to e5. There's an immediate threat. So Nihal is playing with the initiative, creating some threats, making Bogner react. Knight to f6, and now we see pawn to e3. A good plan, just very solid, defending both of these pawns. And what white wants to do here, it looks a little bit slow, but rook to d2, rook to c1, rook to c2. Line up both rooks down the c file, put some pressure on that c7 pawn. And I think Bogner kind of sees this coming. He plays pawn to c6, and he just wants to play extra solid, defend this pawn on d5, and that frees up his minor pieces to move around. Like now this knight on f6 can move. King to h1 by Nihal. So we're still kind of sitting in that like minus zero point 0.1 territory according to the engine. But Nihal's thinking, all right, rook g1, let's start to bring some kingside pressure. You put this pawn on c6, solidifying your queen side. But what's the downside of this move? So I want you guys to think about imbalances in your own games, right? This is just an equal stockfish position. There's not a lot of crazy tactics going on yet. This is a very positional game, and I think these players are thinking imbalances. So if you've read Silman's Reassess Your Chess, or if you've watched some of the other chess goals videos that we've done, I talk about imbalances quite a bit in those videos. This bishop on b7 is now blocked in by the pawn on c6 in addition to the pawn on d5. That means that bishop on b7 cannot easily help defend the king. When this pawn's back on c7, the bishop helps defend e4, right? So sometimes black could even stick a knight on e4, slow down white's attack that way. Currently, the bishop is boxed out. Bishop to d6 played, bishop to f3. So with this bishop boxed out, white is saying, all right, I'm going all in for this kingside attack now. Let me make you think about the kingside. Pawn to c5. So now we see that black, wasted a little bit of time here, c6 and c5. That bishop still runs into d5 though. And he's trying to create some counterplay, right? Make some tension in the center, get some pieces traded off. If the e pawn has to take, if this e3 pawn ends up on d4, these two pawns look really weak. They're isolated doubled pawns. Rook to g1. Here comes the start of the attack. And what I like about this is Nihal's plan just feels so smooth. All he wants to do now is move the rook up, double the rooks, take on g7, take on f7, and get a checkmate. It looks pretty simple, and it's on Bogner to figure out how do I defend against this. Another huge threat in this position is knight to g4. And this is a really good attacking move to remember. The reason this is so good is because count the attackers for white. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we know this d1 rook is coming in very soon as the fifth attacker. Count the defenders for black. 1, maybe one of the other pieces, right? But really, that knight is holding down the king side. So knight to g4 is saying, okay, I want to trade off one of my many potential attackers for your main defender. So queen to e7 was played, and it's a slight mistake. G6 is actually the strongest move, trying to just create this little fortress on the light squares. And I believe bishop to f8 in kind of combination with that, the bishop guards some of these dark squares. Playing queen to e7 allows knight to g4 to be played immediately, and this is pretty strong for white. We're looking at like a .7 stockfish eval now. If you look at the eval bar over here on the left, Nihal is starting to build an advantage, and there's a huge threat here. Knight to h6 check. If you want to try to calculate it, pause the video and see if you can figure out why that's so strong. I'll show you why now. Let's give black kind of a nothing move, pawn to a6. Now we have knight to h6 check. The g pawn is pinned by the rook, so the king has to move. And then there's this huge tactic, rook takes g7. Amazing. We do have the queen still pointing here, and we have two pieces attacking f7. If black takes, knight to f5 check, forking the king and queen, and this is completely winning for white. All right, so back to the game, knight to g4, black takes on g4. That's the top move here. Rook takes g4. And now look at the simple plan by Nihal. Rook to g1 coming next. Double up on this pawn on g7 with both of the rooks. Rook a to d8. And what I like about this position too is if you look at the imbalances again, you would still think black has the bishop pair, white has the double pawns. But those aren't playing a factor here, right? All the imbalances currently that are in play seem to be favoring white, and it's the king safety issue and the weak pawn on d5. Rook to g1. Mate in 2 threatened. Rook takes here, followed by queen there or rook there, mate, depending which way that king goes. Now pawn to g6 played. And here Nihal plays bishop takes d5, winning a pawn. But it's not that easy. It's not just winning a pawn and cashing in for this endgame, because after bishop takes d5, knight takes d5, there's this cool idea by Bogner, queen to e6 attacking the knight, which would also check the white king. And the issue is, if c takes d gets played and the e pawn has to take, then white is stuck with these really ugly pawns. And in a lot of cases after c takes d, you don't want to take with the queen because the knight is pinned down to the queen. So black is saying, okay, I'm okay losing a pawn, but I'm going to get a lot of counterplay if you're not careful here. Now we see rook to g5. A creative idea by Nihal, and I like this quite a bit. C takes d5 played, and now pawn to e4. Queen takes d4 is a good move as well, but let's see what could happen here. Bishop to c5, attacking the queen, and if she retreats, queen to c6, pinning this knight to the king. All of a sudden, you can feel black has the initiative here. Even though the eval is 0.9 for white, and that's because white is up a pawn, black has some compensation for a pawn that brings that eval below 1.0. So Nihal instead plays pawn to e4. Great practical decision. He's keeping all the pressure on black, not allowing those trades to happen, not allowing black to get the initiative, and saying, okay, you can have the pawn back. We're going to material equal here. Pawn to f5. A mistake by Bogner. And this is something where you can just feel the pressure coming from white. This is when players tend to make mistakes. You put them under tough situations, give them tough questions, play with the initiative. Super GMs make these mistakes. Pawn to f5. Only one good move by Nihal, and that's pawn to f3. So white is using the f pawn to reinforce the pawn on e4. He's ready to just capture back. And let's say takes. You might be thinking, could black play queen takes e4? The rook defends, winning a pawn. There's a tactic here. Queen takes, rook takes, knight f6 check, fork. White is up a whole rook. So this knight is actually the key piece in the attack, I think. It's got a lot of crazy tactics with both knight e7 and knight f6 check. So black plays rook f8 in the game, and this is a blunder. The best move is what we just looked at, f takes e, but then not taking the pawn back. This is a blunder, rook f8, and Nihal spots the solution. E takes f5, tripled isolated pawns for white, and black cannot take back due to the pin. Queen takes d5 was played in the game. So now black is up a piece for a couple pawns. F takes g6 played by Nihal, and black resigns right in this position. Even though black is up 1 point in material, bishop for 2 pawns, he resigns here because there's nothing he can do. The problem is if the white queen lands on d4, she cuts off this diagonal in combination with this pawn checking the king. That's going to be a deadly checkmate threat or creating a new queen with this pawn on g6. And the queen not only needs to defend this pawn, but she also needs to watch threats against the black king. So the rook attacks the queen. She can't keep this pawn defended, and she needs to watch threats against the king. So let's just find a move that looks decent. Queen to e6 does allow the capture of this pawn. So we have g takes h7 check, king here, queen to d4 check. If the queen or the rook block, there's going to be rook to g8 check. King takes h7. I'm looking for what's the quickest win. Queen here check, queen block, and rook to g5. What a cool tactic. Oops, sorry. Wrong rook. Rook 8 to g5. So this rook guards the g file. This rook is coming to the h file with mate. What a game. What a game. So Nihal gets the win. Team India 2 wins 4-0 for the third round in a row. And let's jump over and look at the results. So this is the results after 3 rounds. In clear first place based on the tie breaks, we have India 2. So keep in mind what matters most is the +3. So that's 3 points out of 3 games in terms of team matches. The tiebreak number 2 is the opponent team scores. And tiebreak number 3 is the total game points. That's where we see 12 out of 12 for India 2, and that separates them from second place France. It's impressive that the France team is in second when they don't have their 2 top players, Alireza Firouzja and MVL. That's really impressive. And if you look at some of the top teams in terms of seeds, you can see they're slipping a little bit on the tiebreaks. So here's India 1. They only have 10.5 game points. We see Poland down here tied for 14th place with 9.5 game points. Also 3-0 though. Here's England tied for 14th as well. And here's the United States of America. We only have 9 game points. So even though USA is winning their matches, they're not winning them as cleanly as they could be. They won 3-1 in today's games. We see a win from Aronian and a win from Shanklin, both with the white pieces. Bobby and Dominguez Perez drew with the black pieces. And this is something as the opposing teams start to become stronger and stronger, there's a lot more match strategy. Like, can we just squeak by 2.5 to 1.5 or 3-1? And you'll see here, like, I mean, Joe Bava's a monster on board 1. This team is very strong. GMs, all 4 boards, all over 2,500. So these players are getting tougher to beat for the top seeded teams. All right, so let's see the team pairings for round number 4. Ooh, board 1. What a good matchup. India 1 against France. I'm going to look forward to that one. Board 2, we have US against Uzbekistan. Board 3, India 3 against Spain. And on board number 8, we have India 2 against Italy. And I just want to highlight, let's go back to the team list. I want to highlight India 2 for a second here. India 2, yeah, of course, number 1. Look at this team. This team has 4 youngsters, and these players I know pretty well from the Junior SEC Chess.com events. They have Gukesh, Nihal Sarin, Pragananda, and Sadwani. 4 very young players, and then they have Adiban, who's younger than me, I believe, rounding out as the 5th player. They're mixing up the players too, right? So they're letting different players rest each round. It was Prague first round, then Nihal, and then Adiban. But every single player has a perfect score so far. I think this is honestly the team to beat. I think this team could beat the US over the course of all these rounds. You know, maybe head to head they might not beat the US, but they're showing that they have fighting spirit and they're all playing to win. And I think that's going to add up a lot of wins against all the other teams in the field. I think they can hang with anybody. And I'm actually picking India too at this point to win the whole thing. I know there's a lot of higher rated teams out there, but I'm feeling pretty confident in India too. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. Which team do you think is going to win and which team do you want to win? And we will have recaps after every single round. That's the plan. Some of them will be just myself and some will be myself and JD. So thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next recap.